One player stepped onto the floor for the first time in 9 months. The other played a complete game and finished with a single point. Let that sink in for a second. Not one quarter, not one half, a full professional basketball game. 0 made field goals, 1 solitary free throw. And the player who produced that line wasn't a rookie finding her footing or a bench piece logging garbage minutes. She was supposed to be the face of the franchise, standing across from Caitlin Clark. She was supposed to be the counter-narrative, the proof that the WNBA had stars before Clark arrived and would have stars regardless of what Clark did next. Instead, Sabrina Ionescu had 1 point. And Caitlin Clark, 9 months removed from a groin injury that ended her season before it ever truly began, walked into Barclays Center, Ionescu's home gym, enemy territory in every sense of the word, and scored within the first 2 minutes. A floater on the opening drive, a 30-foot three shortly after. In front of a crowd that came to watch the Liberty, she changed the energy of the building before the first media timeout. This is not a story about a preseason game. Preseason games don't matter in the standings. They don't count toward anything official. But what happened at Barclays Center on this particular afternoon matters in every way that statistics cannot measure. And if you walked away thinking the final score of 109-91 was the headline, you missed everything that was actually being said beneath it. To understand what today meant, you have to understand what the last year and a half actually cost Caitlin Clark, because most people have not fully processed the math of what she endured. In 2025, Clark suffered 4 separate muscle injuries, not 1, not 2, 4. A quad strain, a groin pull, an ankle issue, and then the groin again, each one landing at the single worst possible moment. Each one arriving just as she was finding rhythm, just as the Fever were building momentum, just as the league's cameras were pointed directly at Indiana, expecting something historic. The result was a sophomore season reduced to 13 games, 13 appearances in a year when the entire basketball world was watching to determine whether her rookie explosion was a one-time phenomenon or the opening chapter of something that would define the next decade of this sport. Here is what makes those 13 games extraordinary in retrospect. She still averaged 16.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 8.8 assists per appearance. She earned a second consecutive All-Star selection despite playing fewer games than most players use just to shake off the rust of training camp. She flashed between every setback and through every layer of frustration, exactly the kind of talent that made the television networks write those broadcast checks in the first place. The ability was never the question. The body was the question. And for the better part of 12 months, the body refused to cooperate. When you lose that much time in back-to-back seasons, the natural human response is to wonder whether the player you watched in year 1 was the real version, or whether injuries have a way of quietly stealing something that never fully comes back. Explosiveness, court instinct, the split-second trust between the mind and the body that separates elite athletes from everyone else. You can rebuild strength in a training room. You can work on conditioning on a stationary bike. But that first step burst, that attacking downhill mentality, that willingness to drive into contact rather than pull up and protect yourself, those things only return when the body has genuinely healed. Not paper healed, not cleared by the medical staff healed. Genuinely, completely, trust it in a game healed. That was the real question hanging over everything heading into 2026. When Clark showed up to spring camp and told reporters she was fully recovered, the cautious version of every fan and analyst heard exactly what athletes always say when they're trying to project confidence. The standard line, the expected answer. She's fine, she's ready, she's never felt better. Athletes say these things because the alternative is admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't serve anyone in a competitive environment. But the people inside that camp weren't reporting generic positivity.
They were talking about sharpness, the kind of timing that you either have or you don't on any given day. They were talking about lateral burst, the ability to change direction without hesitation, without the microsecond of physical self-doubt that follows an injury that hasn't fully resolved itself. They were describing a first step that looked the way it looked in 2024, not cautious, not managed, not 1% dialed back from what it should be. The kind of explosive first step that physical therapy alone does not restore. That only comes from a body that has rebuilt itself from the inside out and found its way back to something real.
Those reports filtered through the fan base gradually, and as they accumulated, the conversation shifted. The cautious optimism that had defined most of the offseason started giving way to something that felt closer to genuine confidence. Not the manufactured confidence of a press release or a training camp soundbite. The quiet, specific confidence that comes from people who actually watched her move, saying, "She looks right." Today was the confirmation. Indiana's very first possession of the 2026 preseason. Clark received the ball, read the defense, and drove directly into the lane. Not a pull-up jumper, not a safe mid-range look designed to ease herself back into competitive action without taking any real risk. A floater, attacking downhill into contact on the first touch of the first game after 9 months away from a basketball court. The crowd reacted before the ball even went through the net. 2 possessions later, she stepped back to 29 feet and buried a 3. At Barclays Center, in Brooklyn, in Sabrina Ionescu's gym, the same crowd that paid to watch the Liberty came to its feet anyway, because that is what Clark does to a room, regardless of geography and regardless of which jersey the people in the seats are wearing. She changes the energy of a building. She makes the air in an arena feel different. And she did it within 2 minutes of returning from the longest absence of her career. Indiana flew out to an 8-0 run before New York found any footing at all. And even after Breanna Stewart went absolutely nuclear to open the second quarter, 10 straight personal points, completely erasing Indiana's early lead and pushing the Liberty in front at 46-39, the Fever never looked rattled, never looked like a team that was about to fold without its best player on the floor managing her minutes. That composure, that refusal to collapse when Clark was on the bench, turned out to be one of the most important stories coming out of the entire afternoon. But before we get to the supporting cast, we need to address the number that has been sitting in the middle of every conversation since the final buzzer. 1 point. 0 made field goals. Here is the part that mainstream recaps are going to gloss over, because properly understanding it requires context that a box score cannot provide. Ionescu's 1-point performance today was not just a bad individual game. If it were an isolated incident, one rough afternoon against a team that happened to be clicking defensively, the conversation would begin and end with, "Move on, it's preseason, she'll be fine." And honestly, the preseason qualifier would carry real weight. First game back, rust is real, no one is fully dialed in on day 1. The problem is that this was not an isolated incident. Go back through the previous 2 seasons and track Ionescu's performances specifically in the games where the narrative of the moment centered on Clark. The matchups that carried the weight of a genuine rivalry, the games where the spotlight was at its absolute brightest, where every camera in the building was pointed at the court because the broader sports world had tuned in to see what would happen when these two shared a floor. In those games, in those specific moments, Ionescu has repeatedly faded into the background at precisely the wrong time. And the results have been accumulating long enough now that explaining them away purely with circumstance is becoming an increasingly difficult argument to make. Clark's viral step-back threes against the Liberty, the games where Indiana competed and won as underdogs on paper because Clark refused to allow otherwise, the moments where the larger narrative was being written in real time and the player supposed to represent the counter-argument simply wasn't there in the way her talent suggests she should be. That pattern matters.
It doesn't make Ionescu a bad player. She is one of the most gifted guards in this sport, and that is not an opinion. It is the documented conclusion of everyone who has evaluated her seriously. But the pattern exists, and today added its single most glaring data point yet. It needs to be said clearly. Whether there is something psychological at work, whether the weight of operating in Clark's era and Clark's spotlight has settled into Ionescu's game in ways that show up at the worst moments, that is speculation. Fan speculation, community speculation, the kind of theory that lives in comment sections and Discord servers and late-night X threads. It deserves to be labeled as exactly that, and it has been labeled as such here. But it exists, it is loud, and it is going to be the undercurrent running beneath every Fever-Liberty matchup for the next 3 months, regardless of what any of us think about whether it should be.
The rest of the Liberty, for what it's worth, was not a disaster. Stewart looked sharp. Kayla Thornton had 13 points and 6 rebounds in her WNBA rookie debut. Zia Cook-Gardner chipped in 11. The Liberty as a collective showed the predictable first-game rustiness of a team still finding its legs, which is precisely why Ionescu's line stands out so starkly against it. You cannot hide 1 point behind a team's injury report when the rest of that same team performed respectably. You cannot point to rust when Stewart looked ready and Thornton looked confident in her first professional game. The excuse structure simply does not hold when you apply it specifically to Ionescu's afternoon, and the community watching this league is smart enough to recognize that. Clark finished with 7 points on 2 of 10 shooting in 17 minutes. Those are the numbers the casual observers will fixate on, and some will use them to argue that the return was underwhelming or that the concerns about her health haven't fully been answered. That reading misses the point entirely. Evaluating Clark's return by field goal percentage in a controlled preseason debut is like evaluating a quarterback's first game back from shoulder surgery by his completion rate on deep balls. The shooting percentage is not the story. The movement is the story. The instincts are the story. The floater on the first possession, the 30-foot three 2 possessions later, the effortless distribution that produced 4 assists in less than 20 minutes, those moments told you everything about her physical health that a shooting line cannot capture. The body was right. The timing was right. The trust between the mind and the body that you can only verify in live action was clearly, visibly right. What Clark's controlled return allowed was a full look at what this Indiana roster does when it doesn't need its superstar to carry the weight alone. And what it does, as it turns out, is win by 18. Kelsey Mitchell wrote the first chapter of that story. Mitchell, who signed a $1 million contract with the Fever this offseason, the first player in Indiana Fever franchise history to reach that number, stepped up in the exact moment when the game was on the line and Caitlin Clark was unavailable. 10 straight Indiana points when the Liberty had just taken the lead, a step-back 3, a driving layup, a pull-up jumper. Pure competitive will from a player who spent the entire offseason proving that investment was justified. Indiana went into halftime leading 53-48, and the message was delivered without ambiguity. This Fever team was built to win even when Caitlin Clark is sitting on the bench managing her minutes. Then came Daisha Walker-Kimbrough, who may have been the single most impressive individual performer in a game that had no shortage of impressive individual performances. 18 points, 8 assists from the reserve role. Walker-Kimbrough was the player who transformed Indiana's comfortable advantage into something the Liberty had no answer for. A cutting layup, a free throw sequence, a 3 from the corner, a running layup off a Raven Johnson assist that pushed the lead to 23. By the time the Liberty bench started processing what had happened, the game was functionally over. And then there was Raven Johnson. 8 assists in 17 minutes in her professional preseason debut against the New York Liberty. Johnson operated within the Indiana offense with a poise that looked completely unreasonable for a first-round pick stepping onto a WNBA floor for the first time, distributing with the decision-making instincts of a player in her 3rd year, not her first game. 8 assists means 8 possessions where a teammate got a better look than they would have created on their own. 8 possessions where the engine of the offense kept running cleanly rather than stalling at the top of the key.
Johnson's impact doesn't show up on a highlight reel the way a step-back three does, but it shows up in how every other Fever player's offensive game suddenly gets easier, and that is the kind of addition that franchises spend years searching for and rarely find in a draft pick. Kelsey Cunningham, returning from the torn ACL that ended her own 2025 season, hit 3 of her 6 three-point attempts in what amounted to the confidence-building performance she needed after more than 12 months away from competitive basketball. The Fever's depth chart from top to bottom showed up in a way that should concern every team preparing to play Indiana this May. Pull back from the individual matchup entirely, because what today's game revealed at the structural level is bigger than any rivalry and bigger than any single box score.
Every Indiana Fever game in the 2026 WNBA season airs on national television. Every single one. ABC, ESPN, TNT. That broadcast arrangement is not a routine rights deal. It is a statement from every major American network simultaneously declaring that Caitlin Clark has moved beyond women's basketball as a niche product and entered a category of cultural relevance that demands uninterrupted, universal access. To find a comparable broadcast footprint built around a single player in a team sport, you have to go back to the Chicago Bulls dynasty run of the 1990s, when network executives made nearly identical calculations about a player who was fundamentally changing what their sport could charge for its broadcast rights. That parallel is uncomfortable for certain corners of the conversation. The ratings, the attendance figures, the merchandise numbers, and the sponsorship data are not interested in anyone's discomfort. The financial architecture underneath what happened today extends even further than the broadcast deal. The WNBA's current collective bargaining agreement, now in its second operational year, was negotiated directly against the backdrop of Clark's arrival and its demonstrated, documented impact on the league's revenue capacity. Minimum salaries increased. Maximum salaries increased. The charter flight standard that players had been fighting for across multiple CBAs became reality. Every player who signed a contract at a higher number than she would have received before 2024, every single one of them benefits from the economic argument that Clark made possible simply by being extraordinary enough to transform what a women's basketball broadcast deal was worth. Whether that gets acknowledged publicly depends on the player. The math, however, does not change based on who acknowledges it. That context reframes what the Ionescu subplot in today's headline actually means at its deepest level. It is not really about Sabrina as a person or even as a basketball player in isolation. It is about the extraordinary difficulty of operating at the highest level of your profession when the cultural gravity of the moment has shifted so completely toward one player that everyone else on the floor is being evaluated in relation to her, whether they choose to be or not. That is not Ionescu's fault. It is not anyone's fault. It is simply the reality of what Clark's presence has done to this league, this sport, and every conversation happening within it. The question that is going to drive every conversation between now and opening night is the one that today's game answered nothing about, and that is entirely by design. What does a healthy Caitlin Clark playing full minutes in a game that counts actually produce in 2026? The 17-minute, 7-point preseason line tells you nothing about that question. It was never supposed to. Preseason minutes in a first return game are about feel, about movement, about confirming that the body responds the way the mind expects it to when the instincts kick in and the game speeds up. 2 of 10 shooting in a controlled return game does not project onto what 16.5 points and 8.8 assists per game looks like when she is playing full minutes against a team that has to guard her in every possession of a real game that matters. Those are completely different animals, and treating one as a preview of the other misunderstands what preseason games are actually for. What you can project from today is the context around Clark. Mitchell at $1 million is a bargain if today was a preview,
because Clark's gravity opens the floor for the drives and stepbacks that Mitchell converts at the highest rate in that building. Walker Kimbrough as a high-usage reserve with 18 points and 8 assists is a luxury that most franchises in this league would structure an entire offensive game plan around. Johnson's 8 assists in 17 debut minutes is the kind of quiet, foundational contribution that makes every other offensive player's job easier in ways that only become fully visible over the course of a full season. Cunningham, back and shooting the three with confidence, adds a spacing dimension to Indiana's floor that the team simply didn't have for most of 2025. This fever roster around a fully healthy Clark is a different proposition than anything Indiana has put on the floor since she arrived. As for Ionescu and the Liberty, she will be back. She is too talented, too experienced, and too central to New York's championship ceiling to put up 1 point in any meaningful competitive context, including preseason. The fan discourse spreading across every platform following today's result has been dominated by questions about the psychological dimension, whether operating in Clark's spotlight has settled into Ionescu's game in some way that shows up at these specific moments. That conversation is going to be louder than ever heading into their first regular season meeting. But the most honest assessment available right now is that one preseason game, even one this visually stark, does not define what Ionescu is or what the Liberty become this season.
What it does is set the stakes. After everything that happened at Barclays Center today, here is what we know with certainty. Clark is healthy. The movement is right, the instincts are there, and the body has responded the way the mind needs it to for the first time in nearly 2 years. Her team is deeper than it has been at any point since she was drafted, with multiple players capable of carrying significant offensive weight on the nights when the situation requires it. The entire country has a front-row seat on national television every game, no exceptions, for the full 2026 season. And the league that Clark has rebuilt from a niche product into a genuine national conversation now has the stage it has always deserved. May 8th is the real beginning. The standings start then, the games count then, the matchups that will define this season's narrative begin then. But the rest of this league already saw something today at Barclays Center. They saw a player 9 months removed from injury score within 2 minutes on enemy territory, watched her team win by 18 without her playing full minutes, watched a roster 4 and 5 players deep outperform one of the best franchises in the league, and watched the player positioned as the sport's most credible counterpoint produce 1 point in a full game. The franchises that figure out how to compete in this environment will have earned everything they get this season. The ones that continue to shrink in the spotlight, as we watched one of the sport's most recognizable stars do today, are going to find that the gap between potential and performance gets harder and harder to explain with every game that passes. The 2026 WNBA season is right around the corner. Clark is back. The Fever are ready. The only question left is whether anyone in this league has what it takes to stop what's coming.